and welcome to what is the first of this year's College lectures. Those of you who don't know us, we are very much newcomers to the venerable Cambridge constellation, a large and small academic institution. You might like to know that what we do is to find young people who have trained in traditional institutions of Islamic learning and wish to build on that knowledge in the wider world, whether in chaplaincy positions or in mosques, or perhaps using our program as a bridge which enables them to move into the larger world of secular academia, all of those things possible, to find a context in which they can build on their existing body of knowledge about religion and tradition, and understand how best to apply that in the context of the modern world. And we're non-denominational, and we don't impose a particular vision of how young Muslims should be relating Islam to the modern world. Instead, we provide what we hope is an exciting white-knuckle ride through the realities of modernity, its positive and negative features, going back to classical antiquity and coming bang up to date with 21st century debate. Many of you will know that one of our preoccupations is the relationship between religion and science. That indeed is one reason why we decided to open up here in Cambridge rather than elsewhere. And our conviction is that to understand Islam's relationship to modern science and the challenges and the promises which it offers, one needs to refer in a consistent and scholarly way to earlier generations of Muslim thought as they engage with the cutting-edge scientific knowledge and technology of their time. Obviously, lessons from the past can never be effortlessly slotted into modern reality. The science has changed, the cosmology has changed, the society has changed. But when we teach the relationship between Islam and modern science, we do try and give the students an awareness of the historic depth that underlies these controversies. So I'm delighted to be able to start this season with a particularly distinguished contributor whose name has already been bandied about in our seminar room, I think many times already this term. Professor Burnett has come up from the Warburg Institute in London, where he's Professor of the History of Islamic Influences in Europe. He's also a Fellow of the British Academy. And I've been trying to count on his website the number of his publications, but I failed, but it looked as if it was in the hundreds. He's particularly known for his editions of medieval texts, not just from the Islamic world, but more generally. Herman of Corinthia de Essentiis, Abu Matsar on historical astrology, Constantine the African and Ali ibn Abbas and Majusi, the Panteni and related texts, Sefer Medot, a mid-12th century text on arithmetic and geometry, attributed to Abraham ibn Ezra, and so that's just a drop from that ocean. But Professor Burnett has also provided some leading monographs in the same subject area. Numerals and arithmetic in the Middle Ages, the introduction of Arabic learning into England, scientific weather forecasting in the Middle Ages, writings of Al-Pindi, and Arabic into Latin in the Middle Ages, translators and their intellectual and social context. So it really is a great honour for us to begin this series by listening to Professor Burnett. We are most grateful. And the subject this evening will be Arabic learning and the beginning of European universities.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Winter, for that very kind introduction, and I'm very honoured to be the first person to give a talk in this series organised by the Cambridge Muslim College. It is very interesting for me to find out what's going on, and I very much hope that the college will go from strength to strength, and obviously it's got a very important role to play in society. And Tim was suggesting that there might be controversies. Science and religion might be two opposite camps in which do not sit well together. But what I hope to do in this talk is really to show how two different civilizations actually appreciated each other. Or at least Western Europeans appreciated Arabic learning and did not see it as a threat or as something completely alien and other. I would like to start with a passage written by an Englishman in the early 12th century. In his introduction to a rather popular book on natural science, the 12th century equivalent of cosmology, physics, human and animal biology, botany and psychology rolled into one, this author, Adelard of Bath, was brought up at a time when young noblemen were otherwise talented youngsters received their first education from private tutors or in schools attached to the cathedrals in England, and then went abroad to continental Europe for their higher education, still in cathedral schools, to Laon, to Chartres, and to Tours, and so on. Adelard, as a tutor to some noble young men in Bath, tells us that he was taking them to Laon, a notable centre of learning to the northeast of Paris, and he made a pact with one of them, whom he calls his nephew, that he, the nephew, should learn the kind of things that one is taught in France, the Studia Gallica, to the best of his ability, whilst Adelard himself would devote himself to Arabic studies, Studia Arabum, the studies of the Arabs, and that they should meet a few years later and compare the results. Adelard then embarked on an intellectual journey, which took him to several places in the Principality of Antioch, which had recently been established as a result of the success of the First Crusade at the very end of the 11th century. Adelard mentions Tarsus and Mamistra, now in southeast Turkey, Misis rather, while other scholars referred to him as the Antiochene. So we know that he was in this area, southeast Turkey, Syria. He also spent some time in Sicily, which had been under Islamic rule until 1072. It is curious that within the same decade almost, we have the Norman conquest in Great Britain, we have the Norman conquest of Sicily from the Arabs, and we have the First Crusade, which was led also by Normans. After 7 years, Adelard returned to England, and there he met his nephew again, and they engage in a kind of intellectual competition in which Adelard espouses Arabic studies and the nephew draws on his French studies. Adelard characterizes Arabic studies as being new and exciting, and French studies as being traditional and boring. But the main point of contrast is that the Arabs use their brains, they use ratio, reason, whereas the French rely on authority, auctoritas. To quote Adelard's own words, "I have learnt one thing from my Arab masters with reason as guide, but you another. You follow a halter, being enthralled by the picture of authority. For what else can authority be called other than a halter? As brute animals are led wherever one pleases by a halter, but do not know where or why they're being led, and only follow the rope by which they're pulled along, so the authority of written words leads many people into danger, since they just accept what they're told without question. So what is the point of having a brain if you don't think of yourself, by yourself? If I am going to talk to you, the nephew, you must give and provide rational arguments, for I am not the kind of man whom the painting of the skin can satisfy." Here there's an allusion of the painting, the drawing with stylus and ink on the skin, the parchment of sheep and goats, which of course was the way manuscripts were written, but also the painting on the skin of a beautiful lady, a courtesan, a prostitute, which attracts the man, but in fact has nothing of value underneath. Adelard is not the only person to regard the Arabs as the epitome of rational thought. His contemporary, the well-known philosopher, theologian and lover, Peter Abelard, wrote a conversation between a Jew, a Christian, and a philosopher, in which each one explains how his beliefs can lead to happiness and personal fulfillment. Several indications, among them being his circumcision, show that the philosopher is a Muslim, and Abelard, in describing the emotional and intellectual turmoils of his life, at one stage threatens to escape from his Christian enemies by running away into an Islamic country. So the philosopher for Adelard is a Muslim, and an Islamic country has an attraction as being a place where he can think freely. One may note too that even Henry II, the English king, a few years later in 1168, threatened that he would follow the religion of Nur ad-Din, the Zanji Sultan of Aleppo, and become a Muslim if the Pope did not depose his troublesome Archbishop Thomas Becket. There may well have been awareness that tolerance for the people of the book, Jews and Christians, was firmly established in Quranic teaching. Tolerance towards Muslims on the part of Christians is less likely to be acknowledged. But Arabic Muslim scholars were openly respected for their scientific and philosophical talent and their willingness to innovate. John of Salisbury, one of the leading intellectuals of the time, credits the Muslims as the only people to understand geometry, which they pursue for the sake of astronomy. Robert of Ketton, a churchman and friend of the leading theologians of the period, including Burnett of Chartres, quotes a colleague as saying that the Arabic scientist Al-Kindi of the 9th century is the most reliable authority on the science of the stars. One may quote another anecdote by a scholar of the generation after Adelard, Daniel of Morley, who tells us that, like many young scholars, he left England with the intention of studying at the University of Paris, which was now replacing the cathedral schools as the main centre for advanced study. But he found that the professors there were more like donkeys than men. They spent their time engaged in minutiae, legal texts in fact, and had no interest in science. But then he heard that Arabic learning concentrated on the mathematical sciences. Using the terminology of his time, he calls these the quadrivium, the fourfold path to wisdom, consisting of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, and that it was possible to study these in Toledo. So he hastened there and was not disappointed. He studied both with the greatest of the translators of Arabic science and philosophy, Jared of Cremona, and with his Arabic colleague, or Arab-speaking colleague, Ghalib, a Christian from Al-Andalus, what we call a Mozarab. This allowed him to write a book about how the universe functioned, which he called On the Natures of the Heavens and the Earth, in which he begs his reader to accept, and I quote, simple and clear opinions of the Arabs, rather than the obscure statements of Latin scientists who, he says, veil their ignorance under a blanket of unintelligibility. Latin scholars were spurred into doing something about the fact that Arabic learning was superior to their own. Adelard himself translated from Arabic a program of mathematical learning, starting with geometry, the geometry of Euclid, which of course had been translated from Greek into Arabic, progressing possibly through the spherical geometry of another Greek author, Theodosius, also translated into Arabic, to the astronomical tables of Al-Khwarizmi, along with their instructions, which led naturally to dealing with applied astronomy, that is, astrology and astrological magic. Moreover, he described in his own words how to use an astrolabe, basing his statements on an instrument which belonged to a certain El-Merith, who presumably is an Arabic scholar or scientist. We have good reason to believe that Adelard had some connections with the best-known cathedral school of his time, that of Chartres, some 50 miles southwest of Paris. For in the early 1140s, the chancellor there, Thierry of Chartres, who was in charge of the school, compiled a comprehensive 2-volume collection of the essential texts for studying the 7 liberal arts, the basis of the education in the schools. And he included Adelard's translation of Euclid and the astronomical tables of Al-Khwarizmi. Moreover, he clearly encouraged other scholars to translate works. This is Thierry. For Hermann of Carinthia, who calls Thierry his teacher, proposed to him a curriculum in astronomy and astrology consisting of works that he and his colleague Robert of Ketton had already translated or intended to translate in the northeast of Spain, in the valley of the Ebro. It included works by Al-Batani, Ptolemy, Abu Ma'shar, and other Arabic texts on astronomy and astrology. The most comprehensive program of translation, however, is that which took place in Toledo in the second half of the 12th century. Toledo had been captured from the Arabs in 1085 and had been restored as the metropolitan, the main ecclesiastical centre of Christian Spain. And a large number of clergy from France, especially from France, but also from other parts of Europe, came to the cathedral and in an attempt to sort of re-Christian or restore the Gallic right to Spain. And it was this group of scholars, of clergy, whose language of scholarship was Latin, amongst which the translators first thrived, because they had an audience and they had ways of getting their translations back to the rest of Europe. And here we have Dominicus Gundisalinus, an archdeacon who was resident in the cathedral, who died after 1190, and Gerard of Cremona, nicknamed simply the Master, Magister, who lived from 1014 to 1087, 1114 to 1187, who undertook respectively the translation of texts in psychology and metaphysics, that was Gundisalinus, and texts on logic, geometry, natural science, astronomy, and medicine, Gerard. Both translators made their own versions of a very significant Arabic text concerning the range of human knowledge, Al-Farabi's On the Classification of the Sciences. Here, Al-Farabi, who lived in Baghdad in the late 9th, early 10th century, and was described as the second philosopher, Aristotle being the first philosopher. To such an extent did he follow and admire the great Greek philosopher. Here he described the nature and the divisions of logic, mathematics, natural science, metaphysics, and the social sciences, politics, law, and rhetoric. And he recommended textbooks, largely by Aristotle himself, for the individual divisions. Al-Farabi's book, the Ihsa al-Ulum, the classification of the sciences, provided a program for the Toledan translators to follow. And we can see them completing this program over a period of roughly a century between 1150 and 1260. The Western translators were, in the first place, aiming to restore the ancient learning of Euclid, Ptolemy, Aristotle, and Galen, all written in Greek, which they were aware survived amongst both the Greeks in the Byzantine Empire and the Arabs. Thus they had two possible sources to restore to Latin, to fill the gaps in Latin learning, the centres of Greek and the centres of Arabic learning, respectively. They could find copies of most of these texts in Greek, just as scholars in Baghdad had done in the 9th century when they translated them into Arabic. But among the Arabs, the Latins could and did find more than texts. They were also confronted with the results of a tradition of scholarship, which had not only absorbed new elements from other cultures, particularly those of India and Persia, but had also developed, refined, and changed the learning of the ancients. Thus the astronomical models of Ptolemy contended with those of Indian astronomers, and his measurements of the movements of the planets and the stars were repeatedly corrected and often replaced, ever since the official testing sponsored by the Caliph al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century, Zid al-Mumtahan. Aristotle's works on physics, together with the ancient commentaries on them, were transmitted, but Al-Farabi, Ibn Bajjah, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, wrote new commentaries, and Avicenna recast the whole of Aristotle's philosophy in a new, up-to-date form, taking into account advances in medical science. Perhaps even more radical was the replacement of the original works of Galen by new texts on medicine, each generation of Arabic doctors trying to improve on the work of their predecessors. So we have this ancient Greek tradition which was refined, added to, developed amongst the Arabs, and this is what the translators, the European translators, were confronted with. Adelard of Bath and Stephen, the philosopher, who translated works of medical and philosophical works, both refer to their Arabic magistry. So they had not only texts but also teachers, which they encountered in the Principality of Antioch. Other translators benefited from the diaspora of Jewish scholars who had cultivated Arabic learning because they'd lived in Islamic countries, especially Spain, but some of these, we know, were expelled from Islamic Spain by the advance of the Almohads from North Africa in 1160. In some cases, translators appear to have used those scientific works promoted by their Arabic reading masters. For example, Constantine the African, who transmitted the medical tradition of his masters in Kairouan, in Tunisia, when he arrived in Salerno, the medical school in Italy, and Gundeselinus, who translated works of Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, and Avicebron, the authors favoured by his Jewish collaborator Avondouth, who was one of these Jews who had been expelled from Al-Andalus by the advance of the Almohads. Jared of Cremona, while translating several important works by Arabic scholars, especially in the field of medicine, including Avicenna's magisterial canon of medicine, appears to have made a more deliberate effort to recover the ancient texts from amongst the Arabs. But his translating activity coincides with a reaction against modern developments, also on the part of a group of Islamic scholars in Cordova, the chief of them being Averroes Ibn Rushd, who died in 1198, and who tried to restore a pure Aristotle both for natural science and for astronomy. Averroes and his colleague Ibn Tufail, and other scholars in Cordova of the time. One indication of the reverence of the Arabic texts and their authors is the high degree of literalness of the translators. Most translators made no attempt to produce idiomatic and elegant Latin. Rather, they sought to preserve as strictly as possible the Arabica veritas, the truth, the Arabic truth, the truth that was embedded in the Arabic, even at the expense of providing something readable. In some cases, one gets the impression that the Latin is a crib, enabling students to read the Arabic itself, which they would have had access to. But most students would not have had the Arabic text at hand and would have had to glimpse the Arabic truth through the Latin text with the help of teachers and commentaries, which often derived from the Arabic tradition. Any departure from the literal sense was regarded as being a slight on the original author and a sign of the pride and self-esteem of the translator. One had to efface one's own personality, as it were, in the context of the author whose work one is translating. No attempt, however, was made in most cases to hide the fact that the Latin text was based on an Arabic original. And very often this was quite obvious, because not only because of the name of the author, but also because of the number of Arabic words which would be retained in transliteration in the Latin text. This massive movement of translation lasted approximately from the early 12th century until the mid-13th century. Just as the new translations of Adelard at the beginning of this period had enriched the library of the Cathedral School of Chartres, so the translations of texts and commentaries at Toledo and in south of Italy and Sicily and Antioch became the set texts on the curricula of the new universities of Paris, Bologna, Oxford and Cambridge, and of the schools of medicine. We can trace this development through the 12th and 13th century in regard to natural science or philosophy, the study of the universe from the natural principles governing the universe, that is physics, through to the nature of minerals, plants, the animal world, and man, and leading eventually to the study of the first principles, the first cause, and the nature of God, metaphysics or theology. The systematic study of the universe was a new subject in Western philosophy and was based on the works of Aristotle. These were recovered both from Greek and from Arabic from the early 12th century onwards. In Greek, the translations took place in different places and for different reasons. Aristotle's Physics was translated by James of Venice, but at the same time translated possibly in Antioch by someone who also decided to translate the Metaphysics. On Generation and Corruption was translated by Burgundio of Pisa, who also translated certain books of the Ethics, another branch of Aristotelian philosophy. The fourth book of the Meteora, about events in the higher world, causes of rain and thunder and lightning and hail, and halos around the sun and so on, was translated by Henricus Aristippus in Sicily, but translations of some of the small books on natural science, the Parva Naturalia, on sleep and wakefulness, on dreams and on divination, were probably made in Constantinople in the context of an interest in dream interpretation. A more systematic translation of Aristotle's works took place in Toledo, with Gerard of Cremona following the program of Al-Farabi, which I've already mentioned, and translating the Physics, On Generation of Corruption, and the first three books of the Meteora. Alfred of Shareshill continuing with translations of On Plants, the work on botany, which was regarded as giving Aristotle's views on the subject, and on Minerals, a supposedly Aristotelian text that Alfred recovered from Avicenna's Shifa. And finally, Michael Scott, who transferred from Toledo to the court of Frederick II, Hohenstaufen in Naples and Palermo, translated the Arabic 19-book version of Aristotle's On Animals. So the whole program that had been set out by Al-Farabi of Aristotelian natural science was translated successively from Gerard of Cremona through Alfred of Shareshill to Michael Scott. We have the story told by Roger Bacon in the 1260s that in about 1230 Michael Scott came to Paris with certain works of Aristotle and their commentaries. And there is a letter written by Frederick II's son, King Manfred, who reigned from 1258 to 66, to the scholars in Paris, advertising new translations of Aristotle and his commentaries, in which the virgin integrity of the original Greek and Arabic text is preserved. In the early 13th century, the translations of Aristotle's works on natural science and metaphysics were brought together from the extant Greek Latin and Arabic Latin versions into single large volumes clearly intended for teaching purposes. Alfred of Shareshill himself is an early witness to this, for he was evidently responsible for bringing together Gerard of Cremona's translation from Arabic of the first three books of Aristotle's Meteora with Henry Aristippus' translation of the fourth book from Greek, and adding his own translation of the 3 chapters of Avicenna's Shifa on mineralogy. And he cites his own work on in his own work on the movement of the heart, Latin versions of Aristotle from both Greek and Arabic, on the soul in James of Venice's translation, and on sleep and wakefulness in the anonymous translation, but the Physics in Gerard of Cremona's translation. So he's bringing together the text translated from Arabic and from Greek, But he also provided commentaries for the text that he translated on the plants and on the Meteora plus the mineralogy. And the dedications to English scholars, to Alexander Neckwam and Roger of Hereford, and his attestation as a canon of Lichfield suggest strongly that he was actually teaching these texts at the embryonic Oxford University, which was in the diocese of Lichfield Cathedral. So he bears witness to this early collection, which became known as the Corpus Vetustius, including translations of Aristotle's works from Greek and Arabic. This is contrasted with a later collection put together towards the end of the 13th century called the Corpus Recentius, the more recent corpus of Aristotle's works, in which the translations from Arabic were replaced by translations from Greek, and many of the older Greek translations were revised, largely by William of Moerbeker, who died in 1286. These new translations, some of them prompted by Thomas Aquinas, the great church scholar, were made partly in response to controversies regarding the authenticity of doctrines attributed to Aristotle and their compatibility with Christianity, particularly the doctrine of whether the earth was created or not. Aristotle regarded the earth as existing from eternity and to eternity. And this controversy had been brewing throughout the 13th century, with periodic interdictions of either the teaching of the works of Aristotle and his commentators, the whole works, or condemnations of specific doctrinal points, culminating in the list of 219 condemned theological and philosophical propositions drawn up by Etienne Tompier, the Bishop of Paris, in 1277. In spite of these condemnations, which were accompanying the introduction of this corpus of Aristotle's works into the university, the philosophy of Aristotle continued to form the backbone of the curriculum of the arts faculty in Paris and elsewhere for the rest of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. The works themselves were studied in Latin, largely or almost entirely translated from Greek, but they were accompanied by commentaries, and it was the commentaries which retain Arabic doctrine because they were written by Arabs. They had an Arabic provenance. The same Michael Scott, who translated Aristotle's book on animals, was responsible for the translation of several commentaries by Averroes, not long after his death in 1198. His great commentaries on natural science and metaphysics. Another scholar in the court of Frederick II in Palermo or Naples in the early 13th century was asked by the students of Padua University, which was set up in 1222, to translate Averroes' preface to the large commentary on the physics of Aristotle, in which the scientific method is set out. Averroes was regarded as the most reliable interpreter of Aristotle. I mean, there were others. There was Al-Ghazali, there was Avicenna, there was Al-Farabi himself. All these commentators had works translated from Arabic into Latin. But he was regarded as the most reliable interpreter of Aristotle. In the condemnations of Aristotle, he was thus tarred with the same brush as Aristotle himself. Giles of Rome, in his Errors of the Philosophers, written at about the same time as the 1277 condemnations, accuses Averroes of reaffirming all the errors of the philosopher, but with greater obstinacy. And Giles said, he opposed even more vehemently than did the philosopher those who held that the world had a beginning. But Aristotle, accompanied by the commentaries of Averroes, remained the staple of the arts faculties for centuries to come. In the magnificent collection of, I quote the title, All the Works of Aristotle with all the commentaries of Averroes of Cordova on these works that have come down to us, printed in 11 volumes by the Junta brothers in Venice in 1550 to 1552, Averroes' doctrine is hailed as the most solid teaching, not so much drawn from as squeezed out of the water springs of the Greeks. Tommaso Junta goes on to say, Averroes shone out so much that he alone rightly has claimed the name of commentator for himself. And now it should be clear amongst everybody who has practiced philosophy in recent centuries that those parts of philosophy which had been omitted by Aristotle have been investigated most carefully, more carefully by no other person, and no one has established them on more solid foundations. So to sum up, it is no coincidence that the period of translations from Arabic into Latin coincides with that of the establishment of the first universities of Europe. We can see the translations being sent or brought from the places where they were made, in the valley of the Ebro, in northeast Spain, in Toledo, Naples or Antioch, first to the cathedral and monastic schools, and then to the cities in which the universities developed, in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and the medical school of Montpellier and Padua. In arithmetic, geometry, astronomy and medicine, and in the case of interpretation of Aristotelian natural science and metaphysics, Arab authors remained supreme. They were not regarded as being exotic or belonging to another culture, but rather as being the true inheritors of ancient wisdom. Their texts were part of the fabric of Western learning. The translations, in turn, generated commentaries, adaptations, summaries, and supplementary texts by Latin writers. But the source was not forgotten. As late as 1642, John Selden, the English legal historian and expert, Hebraist and Arabist of Oxford, was able to write, I quote, "The liberal and correctly taught sciences were formerly, for a long time, called by us, the English, the studies of the Arabs, Studia Arabum, as if called after the race and the places where they were then alone seriously cultivated. This is clear from Adelard of Bath's preface to his Natural Questions, which he wrote when bringing the sciences back to England from the schools of the Arabs." Thank you very much.
It was clear, I think, model presentation. We've got time for questions. I think
Yes.
very kind. I'm just wondering what the universities would have looked like and it would have emerged in their original sense if there simply had not been the process of translation from the Arabic legacy. What would have been there hypothetically if the translation movement had not been conveying these texts?
Well, that's a good question. Because I mean, there was a native Latin transmission, translations of works on logic by Boethius in the 6th century. So, and logic and grammar would be all right. Theology would be all right. The big question really is why Aristotle was chosen as being the core of university education in the secular sciences, because he needn't have been chosen. They could have chosen Plato. There's some evidence that scholars were interested in a program based on Hermes Trismegistos, which was very much based on ideas of universal harmony of the universe and the influence of spiritual forces within all natural processes. But for some reason Aristotle was chosen, and it was partly because the scholars already knew that Aristotle was the leader in the field of logic, dialectic, and rhetoric. And so they were looking for more of Aristotle, and they found, amongst the Arabs in particular, the integral corpus of the works, and that was established in universities. But things could have gone in a different direction if Aristotle was not chosen as the greatest of the philosophers. It's a very difficult question to answer, really.
Was Aristotle more useful to them because of the methods that he offered, the logic, for instance,
yes,
dialectic techniques that once obviously present in Plato?
Yes. Aristotle was extremely systematic and methodological. And the first thing Jared of Cremona seems to have translated, in fact, is what we call the posterior analytics, which precisely describes how to set up a syllogism, how to argue in a convincing way from first principles, and from first principles leading to necessary conclusions. So you're quite right in saying that Aristotle provided the best guidance as to how exactly to approach any argument, whether it's in science or in theology. And one's thinking of university education, and it's a big debate now, but as not as training for particular professions, but rather simply a training of the mind in pure thought. University education based on Aristotle did not have a direct practical application.
Thank you for your very interesting lecture, and found it very rigorous. And I know you've spoken in depth about the natural sciences, how the study of that in the Arab world was transmitted to Western universities. I'm interested in the transmission of the study of the literary arts from the Arab world to Western universities.
Yes.
I'm thinking of two things here. One is the translation of Aristotle's Poetics by Al-Farabi
Yes.
and Ibn Rushd, and the kind of reinterpretation of his Poetics within his logics, within the corpus of Aristotle's logics, which actually it wasn't reading the original.
No.
And then secondly, I'm thinking of the more general humanistic study which was going on, the study of Adelard in the Arab world, the study of the literary arts, and how that has also kind of been transferred to Western humanistic study, especially kind of the early modern period. So I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, of course, the transmission of the Poetics is a very interesting story in itself, because, as you say, in the Arabic world, rhetoric and poetics was regarded as being part of logic, the culmination of logic, in fact. And what Averroes did with Aristotle's Poetics when he wrote his middle commentary was to make it a study of Arabic poetics. In fact, he substituted many examples, especially of the pre-Islamic poets, for the Greek examples that Aristotle had included in his Poetics. And then when Hermann, the German, translated this in the middle of the 13th century, he himself substituted some Latin examples. Sometimes he tried to translate the Arabic poetry in a poetic way into Latin, and we have what has been called the only anthology of Arabic poetry in Latin. We do not have very much influence of Arabic literary arts in the West, and the Poetics is a rather unusual work in that sense. There were some collections of sayings which already occur in a work of Petrus Alfonsi, who's the earliest, one of the earliest of the translators at the beginning of the 12th century in his Disciplina Clericalis. And we, perhaps at a more popular level, we can see some influence of the Arabic adab literature, but it was not, except for the poetics, it wasn't actually incorporated into the university syllabus.
So when books from a different civilization come, they obviously bring with them a different worldview. So how was the worldview that got transmitted through the books, through the translation, how was the worldview reconciled with the existing worldview in Europe?
Well, the Arabic books that were translated were regarded as belonging to, one might say, ancient civilization, which was a Mediterranean civilization, which was a shared knowledge, a knowledge shared in the Western tradition, shared by the Greek tradition, shared by the Arabs, shared by the Jews, in fact, in the secular sciences. The individual religious, the different religions didn't really impinge so much onto this knowledge. There are examples. I mean, Averroes wrote a very detailed commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics, and metaphysics is the one subject which deals with the first cause and whether the first cause is God, and is the one part of the Aristotelian tradition in which theology can be brought in. And Averroes does bring in some references to Islam in the metaphysics, and it is curious to see that Michael Scott, when he translates this text, he misses them out. So there was an awareness that there was a difference between this common tradition, which goes back to antiquity, and the accretions, as it were, which are specific to an Islamic culture, or even, in other cases, to a Hebrew culture. And these elements were often simply omitted, sometimes for the sake of providing a very literal translation. They will sort of slip through, as it were, and so we do have phrases. I mean, I'm thinking of a work which describes the origin of the different sciences called the De Voto Scientiorum. I don't know. We know that's the translation, but we haven't found the original Arabic text. But there you have the phrase, "There's no God but God," in Latin, and so on. It's slipped in, as it were, but it's not commented on. And then you also have the cases of translators. I think of Herman of Carinthia, who include prefaces to their works and say, we are totally against Islam. And he gives some reasons, some differences, why Islam cannot be accepted, especially in regard to how they view Jesus Christ. But we regard the science of the Arabs as being very important for us. So don't think that I'm a Muslim when I'm translating this. What I'm giving you is valuable ancient science. So the cultural aspect can be overcome, as it were. The difference of culture can be overcome. Yes.
I'm wondering if you could help me by exploring the impact of the 12th to 13th century translations, the corpus of Aristotle, because prior to that, earlier on in your presentation, you explained that the European approach to higher education was considered to be based on authority, whereas the Arabic was considered to be based on reason. Now, considering the nature of the work that had actually been carried out through the Arabic translation, the distillation of additional knowledge, would this not have had a direct impact on the way that thinking and the way that teaching took place within the Western universities at that stage?
Well, what develops, of course, in the Western University is the whole teaching method of disputation, of what we call the scholastic quaestio, which is set out in a very rigorous way, and just gives rules of how you ought to develop an argument in a very reasonable way, rather than simply taking what your teacher says without questioning it at all. The whole basis of university education was through processes of disputation, of finding arguments, counter-arguments, and coming to conclusions according to the most rational means. So, and there is some debate as to whether this very process, the scholastic question, is based on Arabic models, because you do find it in the Arabic world too, and there is one school of thought that says it's not just the texts which were transmitted to the West, but the whole idea of teaching through argument, through disputation, a process of dialogue by which you establish the ratio. Yes.
Professor, you said in the beginning how the East and the West, there was an appreciation for Arabic learning, studium arabum.
Yes.
But there was a time when there wasn't. I think of Pope Sylvester, before he was Pope, who studied mathematics in Spain, and was actually excommunicated, I believe, for a time because of his studies, and got in a lot of trouble. But I guess it was a story that ended well because he became Pope. But
I don't suppose. Yeah, he was accused of learning how to use the astrolabe by communication with a devil. Yes. No, I'm not saying that it's all rosy. That there are there's a whole tradition of describing the subject of imputing to Toledo the subject, the study of necromancy, and that goes. There's so many stories about people who go to Toledo and what they do there. They learn how to communicate with devils and make talismans which have nefarious effects and so on. So we do have this, but this is a more popular tradition rather than a scholarly tradition, where the true value of the translations made in Toledo was appreciated. One could say, I mean, there is a whole area of science which can be described as necromancy in Arabic. This is a translation of sihr in Arabic, magic, which indeed does come from the Arabs. We have a large number of texts in Latin which are translations of Arabic magical texts, how to make talismans, how to summon the spirits of the planets and the stars and so on. And these were condemned. I mean, you have a work attributed often to Albertus Magnus called the Speculum Astronomiae, which starts off by saying what I'm going to describe in this work are those texts which should be accepted and those which should be condemned. And he condemns a whole area of magical texts which come from the Arabs. But it's not because they come from the Arabs that he condemns them. He condemns them because they're magical and involve praying to spirits who are not God and the angels. Yes, we got it.
I mean, did Aristotle did he use the scientific method itself, rather practical examples of the scientific method by Aristotle?
Oh, do you mean by the scientific method what is set out in the posterior analytics and the use of the syllogism and what arguments are, or there's the argument at the beginning of the physics about how one must come up with ideas and then test them against reality, and then having established the basis of your ideas, your arguments, you can make further conclusions. So Aristotle gives plenty of examples, yes, of how to use the scientific method. One other method that Aristotle is well known for using is simply that of cataloguing everything in nature too. I mean, the De Animalibus is a... Yes.
And actually test what he did and find out that he was wrong, and so he changed that.
Scientific method in the sense of actually making experiments. I suppose you would say no, that he's not an experimenter. His scientific method is how to build arguments from the data that you see around you in the universe, rather than testing by experiment.
What's the case of, I don't know, I've heard of a simple case
Yes.
of, is there an egg or something, and if you put it in salt water, it floats, or it doesn't float, something like this? No, I could be wrong.
Yes.
I heard of this example that he did, and some people argue that he did, other people
Yes.
argue he didn't. And this is one example they gave. I don't know if this... No.
Yeah, and there was also there was another tradition which we call the tradition of natural questions, which Adelard of Bath actually fits in himself, which deals with all kinds of questions like why we have 5 fingers, why is the nose above the mouth, why if there's an injury to the back of the head one loses one's memory, whereas if one has an injury to the front of one's head one is not able to reason any longer. And these, one might say, are more based on experiences in life. Well, yeah, I mean, I can't say very much more about that, but scientific method is a way of dealing with evidence, and Aristotle's words are certainly at the basis of many of these discussions. But we also have, I think, from the Arabs, one of the things that the Arabs are introducing are further observations like retesting, observing the stars and finding out and refining the theories about the movements of the planets, as well as in the medical works, actually testing hypotheses about medicine.
I suppose another question I think is where did the Muslim world go wrong? When?
Well, that's another perennial question which keeps coming back. Yes, did it go wrong? Traditionally, one has said that the culmination of Muslim thought is in the 12th century with Averroes, and it was all downhill after that. One reason why we say that is that Arabic philosophy ceased to have a direct or so much interest to Western Europeans after the time of Averroes. But indeed, philosophical works, scientific works kept being written, and if you follow the more recent work in the history of astronomy, for example, by people like George Saliba, you will see him and his like, claiming that in astronomy Arabic mathematicians were improving, developing ideas throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, and in fact Copernicus was aware of the latest Arabic discoveries in planetary movement, and so there was no sort of dropping off, no falling off of advancement in the sciences in the Arabic world. There is less why was there no Renaissance in the Arabic world is a big question. Yes. But there were certainly plenty of things being written in Arabic and continue to be written. But in the philosophical side, it was mainly a question of more and more commentaries on Avicenna, because Avicenna was the height, and then and regarded as, I suppose, giving sufficient explanation of the world around.
So a question, actually quite similar to the question asked by the lady, about it seems that the bulk of the interest by these early Western scholars was in mainly the Hellenistic tradition,
yes,
the Greek tradition.
Yes.
Do you know, was there any examples of an interest in, there's a rich Arab history, work by Arab historians that was present. Was there any interest in kind of translating that and actually using that in these?
I think his history is about the one subject which was completely neglected. I mean, the only bit of history, in fact, is in in one genre which I have done quite a lot in, and that is historical astrology, which explains by the movement of the stars the major events in history. And there, when you're translating an Arabic work on this subject, you actually have a bit of history. But history was not translated as such for its own sake. Of course, the area, a specific area that was translated was the Quran and Islamic theology. But that was translated for the purpose of writing refutations of Islam, not because of a curiosity or a desire to understand Islam better for its own sake. So you're right in saying that it's mainly the Hellenistic tradition which is of interest to the Western translators. Yes, yes. Yes.
Going back to the question about decline of Arabic learning
yes.
in the Muslim areas, I've heard a number of times that the focus shifted from theory to applied, especially after the Mongol invasion.
Yes,
and
yes.
more towards engineering and towards military innovation, and that eventually led to the decline of learning in Muslim world. If you can comment on that, if this is true, if this is a trend, or is this true, or how significant is this in the decline?
I really don't. There are two enormous books written by David King on the practical use of astronomy, the making of Qibla indicators, the use, the invention of all kinds of astronomical instruments by the Mawaqat, who were working in the mosques and determining the time of the prayer. So they had a very practical application. But whether practical, normally a use in practice would encourage further investigations and further writing of theoretical writing. So I can't quite see that would be a strong reason for the alleged decline. So
one last question.
Yes.
So, what are the discernible driving factors or motivating factors for in early medieval Europe that they, in their search for ancient wisdom?
One could say that theological, a Christian or a feeling of awe for the world that has been created by God, so one wants to know God through his works. A feeling that man is superior to the rest of creation in his reason, therefore one's got to cultivate the reason and seek to be wise. A curiosity. We're always talking about a kind of intellectual elite, I think. I mean, the common people are not looking for ancient wisdom. It is an elite within society who regard wisdom in some ways as being power, means to being superior.
I have a question. Why only Greek? Why not, let's say, ancient Indian or ancient Persian?
Well, it was the Greek ancient wisdom that they were aware of. In fact, there is some awareness of Indian as well. Already in the Greek, in Hellenistic times, there were talks about conversations with Brahmins and gymnosophists, naked philosophers. Through Arabic works, Latin scholars became aware of Indian knowledge about astronomy, which talked about periods of enormous lengths of time. Alexander the Great was connected. He had conversations with Indian philosophers, and so there was the idea that the Indians, in particular, were a very wise race. And of course, there was the knowledge of the Indian numerals, which were acknowledged as coming from the Indians. We call them Arabic numerals, but the Arabs called them Indian numerals, and when they were first introduced into Europe successively, especially in the 12th century, they were still called Indian numerals, and so the Indians were regarded as being very fine mathematicians. So it wasn't just the ancient Greek world that was regarded as being worthy of investigation.
Thank you very much. I think at this point we
Thank
have
you.
to stop. As you can see, you've provoked a very lively discussion, and we're very much interested. I believe there is a few minutes for continuing with the refreshments at the end. Is that right? Yes. So we might have the opportunity to ask further questions.
Yes.
In the interim, we're really extremely
Thank
grateful.
you very much. These are